Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'd like to add my refuah shalema, a bracha for Tzvi ben Reina Malca. Indeed, should be a refuah shalema. The very fact that there's so many people joining together during a day for Torah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah tells everyone just how important of an individual and how kind of an individual this person, this neshama is, and therefore, indeed, the Eibush should send brachas for refuah. It should be immediate. You know, whenever I talk to an audience, whether it would be live or these days through Zoom, you think about how each and every one has a story to tell, a story of their own, a life rich with their own encounters, their own experiences. Because each and every single one of you traveled many different and diverse roads. And yet somehow, some way, for some reason, we're all together right now for the next hour. We ended up together at this particular time, even though we're spread apart in different homes and different communities, but for this very moment, we're all together. And if we just think about how did we each get here to this very moment, how many stops along the way of life did it take for you to be here at this very moment? How many choices? How many coincidences, how many decisions, how many career moves for each of us to be here right now at this moment? The journeys of our lives. It makes for a fascinating book. Each and every single one of us can write a book about our own life, and it's filled with many chapters, each focusing on another part of the journey. But right now, at this very moment, it's not just one book, it's not just one story, but it's a library of books for each and every single one of us have our own story, our own journey. And for this moment, this library is coming together. At the turn of the 20th century, two of the wealthiest men in America were a pair of Jewish brothers named Nathan and Isidore Strauss. They were the owners of the Macy's department store, the founders of A&S, the chain store. And these brothers were multi-millionaires. They were known for their philanthropy, for their social activism. And in 1912, the brothers and their wives were taking a tour of Europe. And one day, Nathan had an idea. And he says to the group, you know, why don't we stop over to Palestine? That's what it was called at the time. It wasn't exactly the tourist hotspot it is today. The population was ravaged by disease, by famine, by poverty. And these two brothers felt a strong sense of solidarity with their brothers in the Holy Land. They donated millions of dollars to establish health and welfare centers throughout the country. So this was a chance for them to see their charitable dollars in action. So after about a week or so of going from place to place, Isidore tells his brother that he had seen enough and that it was time to go back. But Nathan wasn't anxious to leave. The more he saw the poverty and the more he saw the hardships and the challenges facing his fellow Jews, the more he felt the burden of responsibility to do something about it. So he and his wife decided to stay on a bit longer while his brother Isidore and his wife Ida went back to Europe. Nathan continued traveling the length and the breadth of the country, contributing huge sums of money towards the establishment of many new educational, health, and welfare programs. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Isidore Strauss was preparing to sail home to America aboard an ocean liner for which he also made reservations for his brother Nathan and his wife. So he sends a telegram to his brother and he says, Nathan, it's time to come home. I made reservations for you. If you don't get back soon, you're going to miss the boat. Nathan reads the telegram and he says, okay, it's time to go, but I still have a few more days. I can still do a little bit more. He waited until the last possible moment to make the connection. And by the time he reached London, however, it was April 12th. And the ocean liner already left port in Southampton with Isidore and Ida Strauss aboard. Nathan was upset that just as his brother had warned, he missed the boat. He just missed it. He was particularly distraught because that was no ordinary, common, everyday cruise that he missed out on. In fact, it was the much publicized maiden voyage of the most famous ship of the century, the RMS Titanic. I don't have to tell you what happened next. For years thereafter, Nathan Strauss was grief-stricken over the loss of his brother and sister-in-law. He was overwhelmed by his sense of rendezvous with history. And until his death in 1931, he pushed his philanthropic activities with such intensity, the likes of which was perhaps unmatched in his time. By the way, during those frenzied days in 1912 that Nathan Strauss spent in Palestine, he financed the creation of a brand new city on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Since his Hebrew name was Natan, the founders of the city named it after him. They called it Netanya. The journeys of our lives, the strange journeys and the circumstances of our lives. We know that before our ancestors entered the Promised Land, they traveled for 40 years in the wilderness. A number of weeks ago, we read the closing portion of the book of Numbers, and there it lists all their journeys throughout the 40-year trek. Eila Maseh B'nai Yisrael, these are the journeys of the children of Israel. And it reads like a travel itinerary. They journeyed from here, they camped here, they journeyed here, they camped here. Why does the Torah have to tell us about each and every encampment? So the Baal Shem Tov explains that all 42 journeys recorded in the Torah are in fact a metaphor for the journeys of each and every single one of us as we travel throughout the course of our own lives. Because every life is filled with many journeys. We're on physical journeys and we're on spiritual journeys. Ever since God told the first Jew, Abraham, Lech Lecha, leave home, the Jewish people have been constantly on the move. From Israel to Egypt, to Israel, to Babylon, to Spain, to Europe, to Israel, to Africa, to India, to Asia, to Australia, to America. Over the past 3,700 years, we have journeyed across every continent. Not always by our own choice. Most of the time it wasn't our choice. But why? Why can't we stay put? Today we have Jews in Angola and in Vietnam and in Thailand. There's Jews in Oklahoma and in Montana and in Alaska. We're everywhere. Why? So the Kabbalah teaches us that when God created the world, he scattered sparks of holiness throughout the world, hidden spiritual treasures waiting to be unleashed and uncovered. And it's the mission of the Jew to go forth and make contact with these hidden sparks that are hidden all over the world, in places we would never suspect. David HaMelech, King David, writes in the book of Psalms, Me Hashem mitzadei gover. The footsteps of man are directed by God. When a Jew comes to a particular place, there is a divine intent, a divine purpose, something, some deed, some mission, some prayer, some act of charity and love needs to happen at that particular spot. The journey of a Jew is never random. So you may think you ended up in Florida by some choice of your own. I'm here to tell you that that's not what happened. God engineered these myriads of circumstances because he wanted you here right now for a unique purpose, for a unique mission, and it's no accident. It's not coincidence. Now, whether or not you actually fulfill your mission, that's your choice. That's your free choice. But the journey, the opportunity, says David HaMelech me Hashem, that comes from God Almighty. You know, we're all familiar with the word bashert as referring to the spouse that one is destined to meet in marriage. But in truth, the word bashert, destiny or meant to be, doesn't only apply to the journey of marriage. It applies to all journeys of life. Some 50 years ago, Rabbi David Shachat of Toronto, Canada, was asked to lecture to a non-Jewish group in the city of Buffalo, New York. And being that he would be speaking to a non-Jewish audience, he decided to focus his lecture on the universal theme of charity. Charity is something people of all religions, of all faiths can relate to. And so he began his lecture in Buffalo, New York, to this non-Jewish audience with the following story about charity. So this is the story that Rabbi Shachat told that day. Many years back, in the city of Krakow, there lived a very wealthy individual, but he was a miser. He never contributed a dime to charity. He was the biggest miser the community had ever known. After the miser died, the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, felt that considering how greedy and selfish this man had been during his lifetime, he was unworthy of being interred in the cemetery next to any respected individual. So they buried him instead in an area of the cemetery they called Hektish. That area was reserved for what we would call the John Does of society. A few days after the funeral, there was a commotion in the city. Two prominent members of the community, the butcher and the baker, who had always been extremely charitable, suddenly stopped distributing funds to the poor. And many people who relied on these two benevolent individuals for their sustenance were told that it's over. Sorry, we can't support you anymore. The paupers in town got very, very upset. Emotions ran high, so that the matter was brought before the great Jewish sage of that time. His name was Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman. He was known as the Tosfos Yom Tov. The rabbi brings the butcher and the baker together, and he says, I don't understand. Every week it was known that people that were poor would go into the butcher, go into the baker, they would get food for free for Shabbos because he was so charitable. How is it now, all these years later, that suddenly you're stopping to support the needy families? Why are you cutting them off? It was such a wonderful thing that you did. So they said, Rebbe, we weren't and never were able to support these people. All these years, the man everyone known and thought was the biggest miser in the community, he was the one that would always support the food we distributed. He asked us to keep a cheshbon, an accounting, of any poor person that would walk into our store, that we should supply what is needed, and he would cover the bill on one condition. It remained quiet. No one should know. He wanted the merit of being given tzedakah without no one knowing, no awards, no publicity. But now that he's dead, we don't have anyone to take his place, and we can't afford to give out all this food. The Tosfos Yom Tov was in total awe of this miser's behavior. And he felt such regret at the way he was treated in his passing. No one went to his funeral. Buried on the outskirts of a cemetery in the Hektish section of the cemetery, and he spent countless hours praying at this man's grave, begging for forgiveness for the way the community acted towards him upon his passing. When the Tosfos Yom Tov himself passed away, he left instructions about his own funeral. And he asked that he wants to be buried next to the miser of Krakow, next to that humble individual in the Hektish section of the cemetery. And so till this day, the Tosfos Yom Tov is buried right next to this individual. Rabbi Shachat concluded his lecture about charity, about giving charity. After the lecture is over, a fellow that was in the audience, who happened to be a priest, approaches Rabbi Shachat, and he says, can you repeat the story? Tell me the story again. So he briefly tells him the story. And he can see that the priest is really disturbed. He's in deep thought. And the priest says to Rabbi Shachat, can you repeat the story again? So Rabbi Shachat says, it's late. I traveled today. If you'd like to continue our conversation, why don't we meet tomorrow morning in the hotel lobby and we'll talk? Rabbi Shachat comes down in the morning not expecting to see the priest there, but sure enough, he's there in all of his dress. He's right there in the lobby. And again, Rabbi Shachat tells him over the story. And then finally, Rabbi Shachat says, why are you so interested in this story about the miser of Krakow? And he says, I'll tell you why. Because that man in your story, that miser of Krakow, is my ancestor. So Rabbi Shachat smiles and he says, I don't think so. There can't be any connection between you and this story. First of all, the story took place hundreds of years ago. And the story is about a Jew. The way you're dressed tells me you're not so Jewish. So the priest says, let me tell you a story. I grew up in Tennessee. My father was a major in the United States Army during the Second World War. While overseas in Europe, he met a Jewish girl and he fell in love. He brought her home as his bride and no one knew of her Jewish background. A short time after they're married, they had a child, me, who they raised in the Catholic tradition. I grew up, I attended seminary, and I eventually trained to become a priest. A number of years ago, my mother became very, very ill. She called me to our bedside and she said, my son, I don't have much longer, but I need you to know before I leave this world that I'm Jewish. And that means that you're Jewish. And she told me that I have an ancestor. And you should know that this ancestor is buried next to a great sage called the Tosfos Yom Tov. And then she recounted almost verbatim the story that you told last night in your lecture. And shortly thereafter, she passed away. At that time, I imagine my mother must have been delirious. Her parting words made me feel a little uneasy, but I figured, it was just a fleeting thing. I'm not Jewish, I'm a priest, I got to go on my life. And I forgot the entire episode, and I lost interest in the subject. Rabbi, the priest says to Rabbi Shachat in a state of complete emotional upheaval, you have just repeated the story detail for detail exactly as my mother told it to me years ago. And you reminded me of her parting words. And I know now that her story must be true. What should I do? I'm a popular priest. I have a large congregation of devoted followers. Rabbi Shachat offered to assist in any way. He gave him the phone number of Chabad in Buffalo, told him to be in touch with them, because I'm not from here, I'm from Toronto. And he tells him, look, being a Jew means you're always Jewish, and you should explore it and look into it. After that incident, Rabbi Shachat put the matter out of his mind as well. He moved on with his life. A decade or two goes by. Rabbi Shachat is at the Western Wall in Eretz Yisrael on a visit. And this bearded religious Jew comes up to him and says, Shalom Aleichem. Rabbi Shachat answers, Aleichem Shalom. He says, you don't recognize me, Rabbi Shachat. And he says, no, I don't. He says, if I told you about a priest in Buffalo, New York, in the hotel lobby, does that ring a bell? That's me. That's me. The journeys of life. Now here, ladies and gentlemen, comes the rest of the story. A number of years ago, Rabbi David Shachat was looking into his own genealogy. And get this, he discovered that he's a direct descendant of the Tosfos Yom Tov. And so, at an auspicious juncture in time, in a hotel lobby in Buffalo, New York, a descendant of the Tosfos Yom Tov met with a descendant of the miser and paid back a debt of hundreds of years earlier and changed the course of destiny. There's a connectivity between us, a connectivity amongst our soul that is beyond what we can see in the here and now. Who sent Rabbi Shachat to Buffalo, New York that day? Was it an invitation that he received? No. Why was he really sent there? Was it to give a lecture? No. There was something more powerful going on, the journeys of our lives. All of our lives' experiences, all of our frustrations, our setbacks, our disappointments, our joys, our celebrations, our successes, our victories, are journeys designed to lead us to our own promised land. God guides the footsteps of man. Each person's journey are custom made specifically for his or her needs. Now, these journeys can either turn out to be meaningless treks that might as well have never happened, or they can be of awesome significance, of biblical proportions. The Talmud says this. The Talmud says that had Reuven, the eldest of the 12 sons of Jacob, had he known that his actions would one day be recorded in the Torah, he would have taken his brother Joseph, He would have carried him on his shoulders back to the safety of his father's house, regardless of what the other brothers might have said about it. That's what the Talmud says. Had he known that this would have been recorded, oh, he would have behaved differently. What does that mean, had he known that his actions would be recorded in the Torah? That he would have postured himself differently to look better in the press, in the bestseller of all times? No, it means, had he foreseen the far-reaching effects of his actions or lack of actions at that critical juncture, how it affected the entire course of history thereafter, how much differently would he have acted? Had he only known at the time that the decision to leave his brother in that pit was biblical proportions, affecting generations and centuries and a history to come, how different would have been the choices he made. My friends, you never know. You never know which event you experience, which decision you make can be a history-making moment of your destiny. Which decision will change the course of your lives? Which decision you make today will be the one to change the lives of your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren? But this much we do know for a fact, that any time God places you in a situation where you can do a mitzvah, where you can help another human being, where you can connect to your heritage, where you have a choice to do something on your journey, then that, by definition, is a biblical moment. It's a major moment, because every single act of goodness and kindness, every mitzvah, has a ripple effect. And that ripple goes out there and becomes a wave, a tidal wave that washes across the entire universe. And it affects the present, and it affects the future in ways we can't even imagine at the time. Again, a story from the Talmud. The Talmud tells us about the great sage Rabbi Yochanan. At the time of the story, he was already quite old. And he was once walking with his students, it says, from Tiberias to Tzvi in the north of Israel. Anyone that's ever been to Israel and you've visited the city of Tiberias, and Tiberias you've driven to Tzvi, you know that windy road. It's about 18 miles of uphill journey. It's an uphill climb. Even when we drive it, it's a difficult drive. But Rabbi Yochanan was walking it with his students. He was poor and he couldn't afford a donkey. So it says he was walking. He was already an old man. They passed a huge field along the way. Rabbi Yochanan says to his students, you see that field? I used to own it. You used to own it? Why don't you own it anymore? He says, I sold it. Why did you sell it? Because I wanted to build a yeshiva. So I needed the funds, so I sold the land. They continued walking, and shortly thereafter they passed an orchard. Rabbi Yochanan again points to it and says, you see that orchard? I used to own it, but I sold it in order to maintain the yeshiva. And then they passed a vineyard. Again, he points to the vineyard. I used to own it, but I sold it to keep the yeshiva growing. Upon seeing and hearing all of this, the students of Rabbi Yochanan cried out, and they said, how sad it is, dear Rebbe, that we see you this way. You once owned all of these properties, and now look at you. You're old, and you're tired, and you're poor, and you can't even afford a donkey, and you're traveling this strenuous journey of 18 miles by foot. Rabbi Yochanan says to his students, don't be sad for me at all. Rejoice for me. Rejoice for me, because I don't have a single regret in this world. If I had to do it all over again, I would exactly the same way. My friends, it's been over 1,800 years since the great sage Rabbi Yochanan lived on this earth. Today, you can go into any center of Torah study in any part of the world, and you will hear yeshiva students studying the words of Talmud, and you will hear them say, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says this. Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan taught us that. Does anyone remember the fields that Rabbi Yochanan once owned, or the fields owned by the richest land barons of those days? No one remembers. No one knows. No one cares. But the words of Rabbi Yochanan, the teachings of Rabbi Yochanan from that yeshiva that he built with his blood, sweat, and tears, that continues to resonate in the hearts and minds of Jewish children for time immemorial. If we want to give our children something truly precious, if we want to give our children something truly valuable and indestructible that will sustain them on their journeys through life, we have to give them the gifts that matter most: a sense of connection to their past, a sense of mission and purpose in the present. I read in a book by Rabbi Benjamin Blech, a wonderful, wonderful author. If you don't have his books, you should order them. They're fantastic, each and every single one of them. And in one of his books, he describes this scene from a comedy film where the main character is played by Billy Crystal. And he was asked to address the children in his son's class. And he says to the class, this is all part of a film, this is the monologue, he says, value the time in your life, kids, because it goes by fast. When you're a teenager, you think you can do anything, and you do. Your 20s are a blur. Your 30s, you raise a family, you make a little money, you think to yourself, what happened to my 20s? Then you get in the 40s. You grow a little pot belly, you grow another chin, the music starts getting too loud. One of your friends from high school becomes a grandmother. You get to your 50s, you have minor surgery, but you call it a procedure, but it's a surgery. In your 60s, you have a major surgery. The music is still too loud, but it doesn't matter because you can't hear it anyway. You get to your 70s, you and your wife retire to Florida somewhere. You start eating dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You have lunch around 10 o'clock. You have breakfast the night before. You spend most of your time wandering around malls looking for the men's room and muttering, how come the kids don't call? How come the kids don't call? How can we assure that our lives don't mirror Billy Crystal's monologue? How do we pass on to our children that there's more to life than just the skills to earn a respectable income? How to love and how to be loved. How to be a giver and not just a taker. How to fulfill their life's missions and leave a permanent mark rather than just survive. How will they learn the essential things that can lend meaning and purpose to every day of their lives as they go on their journey of life? The only force that will infuse our children and ourselves with a higher sense of values and purpose is spirituality, Yiddishkeit, a spirited Judaism, a deep sense of the soul within each of us and the mission of the soul's journey in life. If you want to give your child that which will last, give them the gift of Jewish memories. Let them understand the greatness from which they come, the greatness which they will have an opportunity to pass on to their children and to their grandchildren. Back in the 1990s, when communism finally fell apart and Hungary gained independence from the Soviet Union, people suddenly had freedoms the likes of which they hadn't seen since 1956 when Russia invaded Hungary. For the first time in decades, people were able to make their own choices regarding the schooling of their children. And so, like everywhere all over the former Soviet Union, Jewish schools began opening up all over Hungary. And one such school was opened in Budapest. A team of American teachers and rabbis came out to spearhead the effort. They placed ads in the paper hoping to start the school with at least 50 children. On the first day of registration, 450 children and their parents show up. The crowd was 9 times greater than they expected. Contingency plans were made to accommodate the overflow registration. They divided the parents up into different groups of 10 to talk about the school year. During one of these discussion groups, the rabbi asks the question that was on his mind all this time. Tell me, why so many people are here? Why are you all wanting to send your children to this school? Why, after so many years of not having a religious education, do so many people want to enroll their children here? I'm not upset, he said. I'm just surprised. We didn't expect this. What's the driving force behind this? And the parents were a bit surprised at the question, but they were willing to talk about it. And each one had a different answer. One spoke about memories gone to a cheder when they were a child. One spoke about anti-Semitism in the public schools. One spoke about the memories of a bubby. All this time, there was a man sitting in the back that was quiet, didn't join in the conversation. And the rabbi turns to him and says, "And what's your story? Why are you here?" He says, "It's a hard story to tell, but because you ask, I will tell it." I was a young child of 7 years old when the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, occupied Hungary in 1944. They knew that the war was almost over for them, but in their sick obsession to kill as many Jews as possible, they rounded up as many of us as they could to send off to Auschwitz. Hungarian Jewry were terrified. One night, I'm 7 years old, I'm lying in bed, and I hear my parents arguing frantically. I came down to hear what they were saying, but the door to the living room was locked. So I looked through the keyhole to see what was going on. My father was very agitated. He said to my mother, "Look, we don't have to worry. No one knows we're Jewish. We don't look Jewish. We never did anything Jewish. We have no Jewish friends. There is nothing in this house that will point to our Jewish identity. Don't worry, we'll get away with it." To which my mother said, "I hear that they come with lists. They have lists of all the Jewish people. I hear they come with lists. What if our name is on the list? What if someone turned us in?" My father said to my mother, "So what if they come here with a list? We'll let them in our house. We'll let them search our whole house, and they'll see that there's nothing Jewish here. We'll get away with it. Don't worry." As my father said these words, "We'll let them come in and search the whole house, and they won't find anything Jewish," my father stops mid-sentence, and he's staring at the bookcase. And he's staring at the highest shelf of the bookcase. And my mother begins staring at the highest shelf of the bookcase. My mother walks over to the bookcase and she reaches up and she takes down a book. It was a siddur. It was a prayer book. It was the siddur that our mother had given her on the day of her wedding. The same siddur that her mother's mother had given her mother on the day she got married. My mother took the siddur from the shelf. She leafed through the pages, and tears began running down her cheeks. She turned to my father and looked at him, and I'm watching this through the keyhole, and my heart is pumping rapidly. And then she looked at the burning fireplace, and she tossed that siddur into the fire. And as the siddur was consumed by flames, my mother fell to the floor in anguish. I ran upstairs. I threw myself onto my bed, and I cried like I never cried before. I cried for hours. No, we had no Jewish friends. We never acted Jewish, never observed anything Jewish, never celebrated anything Jewish. And yet I knew in my heart that what I had just witnessed was an awful and terrible thing. I felt as if part of my soul had been ripped out of me, as if my family's journey had suddenly come to an end. In all my years since, I have not been able to shake the pain of what I saw that night. In my mind, I always see those pages burning, and the tears just come. And so you ask me, why do I want to send my child to this school? I'll tell you why. On the first day of school, I'm going to proudly walk into this building, and I'm going to hold my son's hand. I'm going to walk into his classroom with him, and I'm going to hand him a siddur. And my tears from that night will finally stop flowing. My friends, that is the awesomeness and the eternity of the Jew. The journey must continue. The journey must go on. The faith and the devotion and the perseverance of the Jew. The journeys of the Jewish people are not separate, isolated incidences. It's all part of one continuum. The past is the present, and the present is the future. All of our journeys are interrelated and interconnected. And yes, part of our journey was difficult, and part of our journey was painful. And yet, not only have we survived each and every one of them, we have emerged from them stronger, prouder, more resilient. Wherever we went, we didn't allow the flames of evil and hatred to engulf and consume us. From out of every darkness, new light came forth. From every tragedy and setback, renaissance and renewal. From every stretch of pain and adversity, we've found new cause for celebration and for rejuvenation. We are all links in this vital chain, connecting our parents and our grandparents to our children and our grandchildren. Jewish history and destiny waits for you now to actualize your life's calling by making your mark and your contribution. I want to share with you an amazing story. One of my father's closest friends, back from his childhood days growing up in Chmelnik, Poland, was a man by the name of Rabbi Chaim Meir Bucket of blessed memory. Some of you know Rabbi Zalman Bucket from Boca. His father, Rabbi Chaim Meir, and my father grew up together. Rabbi Bucket was the patriarch of a beautiful family. Many of his children and his grandchildren now serve as Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins all over the world, and perhaps some are on the Zoom call right now.
Rabbi Zalman Bucket is on.
Hi Zalmi. Rabbi Bucket was a Rebbe in the yeshiva throughout the year. And in the summertime, he would go to the Catskills, where he would teach summer yeshiva. In the summer of 1970, for whatever reason, the learning program in the Catskills was canceled. So his daughter, Ruchi, who lives here in California with her husband, Rachmiel Stillman, they were running the campus program in UCLA out of the Westwood Chabad House. They said to their father, why don't you come with the rest of the family and spend a few weeks out here? You'll visit us here in California. Rabbi Bucket himself was not so comfortable with the idea just to go on a vacation. It was unheard of. These Polish Hasidim didn't believe in vacations that much. For them, it was learning and learning and learning. And especially then, travel from the East Coast to the West Coast was not as easy and affordable as it is today, especially for a whole family. They would have to travel by train, and that would take days and days. But the Stillmans were persistent. So Rabbi Bucher decided that he would write a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and seek the Rebbe's opinion. And so he wrote, there's no yeshiva program this summer. My daughter and son-in-law want us to go out to California, but I don't know, should I go? And the Rebbe responded, Kedai lo, it's a good idea, it's a good thing to go, it's worthwhile to go, and the Rebbe gave a bracha. So at this point, Rabbi Bucket now feels that he's being sent as a shliach, he's being sent on a mission, now he can go. So the entire Bucket family boards a train en route to Los Angeles. The first Shabbos here, the Stillmans explain that they run a Friday night dinner at the Chabad of Westwood for college students. And they're trying to explain to their white-bearded father that it may not be exactly the same type of environment like his shul in East Flatbush. It's slightly different. I remember the first time my father came out having to have that same type of conversation that people are dressed differently perhaps, and they may come by roller skates perhaps, trying to break it in that it's not exactly what you're used to. And especially then, there was the hippie movement, there were various different types of movements, especially on the college campus. Rabbi Bucket explains to his family, you don't have to worry. It's okay. I understand. I quite get it. That Friday night in the Chabad House in Westwood, after the evening services, it was time for the meal. Rabbi Bucket, of course, was invited by Rabbi Kinnan to sit at the head of the table with all the other rabbis, and he said, no, not interested in sitting at the head table. I want to sit here with the chevra. I want to be with the college students. And he sat with them, and they're pounding the table, and they're singing together. One of the guys, during the meal, as he's rapping with these students, the guy sitting right next to him, this eccentric fellow, his name was Tuvia. Tuvia was a genius. He knew 17 languages, including Yiddish and Swahili. At one point, Tuvia asked Rabbi Bucket, knew where you're from? So he said, I'm from Poland. He said, really? Where in Poland? He said, a little village. He never heard of it. So Tuvia says, try me. I've been around. I know some things. Okay, Rabbi Bucket says, I'm from Chmelnik. Have you ever heard of Chmelnik? Not to be confused with Chelm. Chmelnik. I don't know about you, Zalmi, but every time I say Chmelnik, I always have to add, not Chelm, Chmelnik. So Mr. Swahili here says, I never heard of Chmelnik? My grandparents were from Chmelnik. Not only were they from Chmelnik, but they belong here in Los Angeles to a group called the Chmelnik Society. Chmelnik Society? Never knew there was such a society. Remember, this is pre-Google. They couldn't do searches to find out who else survived from Chmelnik. So he's hearing that there's a Chmelnik Society here in Los Angeles. So they get around to talking. Rabbi Buka tells Tuvia that he was an only child and that for years and years he's been trying to find some record, some trace of what happened to his parents. But nobody was able to tell him anything. Perhaps somebody from the society would know something. So Tuvia assures him that he'll get back to him. Shabbos was over. The following Thursday, the phone rings in the Stillman house. Mrs. Stillman, my name is Chana. I am a member of a small group here called the Chmelnik Society. And I'm a close friend of Tuvia's grandparents. It's very important that I meet your father. I have something important to tell him. They make up to meet Sunday at the Chabad house. Rabbi Buket sensed that this wasn't going to be an ordinary encounter. So that Sunday he asked all of his children to dress in their Shabbos clothing. And they went to the Chabad house. The woman was waiting for them. A very distinguished, elderly-looking lady. The woman says to Rabbi Buket, I knew your parents in Chmelnik very well. I was a very good friend with your mother, Rachel Buket, alav shalom. I want you to know what happened during those last days in our city after you left. And she tells him of those last days and the roundups and the deportations. She said, your mother, my daughter, and I were in a boxcar together, being transported to the Treblinka death camp. We stayed close to each other throughout that harrowing journey. While we were traveling, I looked up and I saw this little window, this tiny opening on the top of the car. And I noticed that every so often the train would slow down. And at one point I told your mother that the next time the train slows down like that, we should hoist ourselves up to that window, squeeze through, and jump out and make a run for it. Your mother said, I'm too weak to do it. I won't be able to. I'll slow you down. We'll all be killed. I can't make it. The next time the train slowed down, I turned to your mother and I said, Rachel, please, let's go. Let's go now. And she said, I can't. You take your daughter and you go. Rabbi Buket, I want you to know what happened next. Your mother took me and turned me to face her. She looked me in the eye and she said, if you ever meet my son, Chaya Meir, I want you to give him a message from me. Tell him, as ich hab gemacht, as Zecher. I left an imprint in this world. I left a memory in this world. Our lives are not for naught. They can't take away our memory. Our journey goes on. If you survive and somehow God ever brings you face to face with my son, give him a message from me. Ich hab gemacht a Zecher. I left an imprint in this world. She told me these words and I will never forget them. I grabbed my daughter, I hoisted her up through the window, I scrambled out, jumped off that boxcar, and miraculously we survived. In all of my years since, I've wondered if you were alive. I wondered if I would ever meet my friend's son. If God would ever allow our paths to cross so that I can give her her final message to you. And now I see you and your beautiful family. And Rachel was right. She made a zecher. She left an imprint in this world. And today, the hundreds of children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of Reb Chaim Meir Bukat Olav Shalom, they are that Zecher. And the tens of thousands that they inspire daily, that's the Zecher, that's the journey. The journey continues. Eila Maaseh B'nai Yisrael, these are the journeys of the children of Israel. My friends, throughout our lives, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, they send us messages and they're telling us, we made a Zecher in this world and now it's your turn. This is your time. Take that siddur and give it to your child. Take that siddur and give it to your grandchild. Take that siddur and give it to someone else's child. We have the ability to put a siddur in the hands of every single Jewish child on the face of the earth. Whatever time in history did we have such an opportunity, such freedom, that we can spread Yiddishkeit like never before? That's our journey. Let's take advantage of every day, of every opportunity to create an everlasting imprint in this world. Spiritual journeys know no bounds. They transcend time and space. They are forever. We can be years apart, centuries apart, worlds apart, but we can still feel their presence in our midst. We don't understand God's ways, and we cannot begin to understand why our people have had to take the journeys that we have. But we do know that our ancestors have weathered those journeys with unbelievable faith, love, and devotion. And we, me and you and every single one listening today, we are blessed that our part of the journey is to rebuild. After so much devastation, after so much destruction, our generation, you and me, we are the contractors of Jewish history. We are the fortunate generation that our job is to sanctify God in times of freedom and plenty, perhaps the most critical time of our journey. So let's take advantage of the journey that we are, the journey that we are on. After having seen so much destruction in our history, we have the part of the journey of renewal and rebuilding. As Jews, we never forget. We never stop crying over what we lost, but at the same time, we never stop journeying forward. We go on building bigger and stronger and better and brighter. There will be no physical destruction of our people. There will be no spiritual destruction of our people. As the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the tzaddik, and the visionary of our time assured us, there will never again be another Holocaust. Those journeys are over. The Rebbe assured us that the day is close when the entire landscape of our history will finally be revealed before us. And we will finally see how all the millions of journeys stretching across thousands of years and millions of miles all lead to one central destination in time and space. All roads will lead to Eretz Yisrael. All roads would lead to Yerushalayim in the days of Mashiach. All of the sparks have been extracted. All of the journeys completed. And on that incredible and awesome day, God and humanity, physical and spiritual, past and present, will converge in this terrific unity. B'yom hahu yiyeh Hashem echad u'shema echad. The world will be at peace. The world will be one. May it happen now. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Bryski, for the wonderful inspiration. It is so apropos for this time of the year, entering the month of Elul before Rosh Hashanah. We ask Hashem that our journey should be only with revealed good, and especially for Tzvi, should be his journey with revealed goodness. We did Torah and Tefillah here together. We ask everyone to put something in the tzedakah box together here now for the schus of Refuah Shalema, for Tzvi ben Reina Malca. And we hope and pray that this Shabbos brings healing to Tzvi and to everyone, B'teich Shar Cheli Yisrael, Thank you everyone for joining together. Don't forget that every kapitel tilim, every act of goodness for the schus of Tzvi's refuah will bring him tremendous healing. And we will be joining together again the next lecture, Torah Tefillah and Tzedakah, together with Tzvi in Mitzvah Hashem. Rabbi Pinny has an event coming up Wednesday this week.
Yes, this Wednesday night. It's we're confirming. We have something very, very special in store, but we're just confirming the lineup. So we encourage everybody to stay tuned to Facebook and join Chabad of Florida and look out for the upcoming event. Rabbi Bryski, I want to thank you so much for a very powerful and beautiful message for today. And truly, may your words ring true for each and every one of us to do increase in our Torah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah for Tzvi, and for all those who need our prayers for complete and speedy recovery. A good Shabbos, everyone.